Miranda met her husband's grandfather 3 times. Before the wedding, when she met the inner circle of relatives at some family celebration. At the wedding itself, and on the day of the funeral of Barbara, my husband's grandmother, grandfather gave the impression of a stern man. A tall old man with deep-set brown eyes, under shaggy eyebrows, gave her, a fragile girl, a superstitious terror. He was silent at the communal table, glancing around at the relatives with his unfriendly gaze. The retired former police officer was an unsociable man. "Can you imagine? The whole apartment is ours," rejoiced Charles as he poured himself his evening coffee. "I don't know, Charles." Miranda sat at the table in the kitchen of the rented apartment and didn't look up at her husband. "What's to know?" he wondered. "No renting and constant moving around. No extra money and no selfish landlords. You remember how we had to pack in the night a couple of times." "I remember." Miranda smiled slightly. It made her laugh now, but back then they had moved another family in for a couple of days until they found another place to live. Another time, the apartment actually belonged to a sailor who had suddenly returned home from a voyage. True, the latter did not allow the young family to leave his abode. How do you throw people out a night out? Gone to a friend to celebrate his return, and asked to leave the keys to a neighbor with whom the guys signed a lease. But at night they stayed up and packed their bags. How many more times would they get screwed like this? And here's their own place. What's wrong with that? There. It's much better than it was. Charles took up his cooling coffee again. And don't be scared of Grandpa. It's a 2-bedroom apartment. He has his own room, and he's quiet. Miranda nodded, trying to calm her inner anxiety. She directed her thoughts to the happy side. They would have their own corner. Now they could lay out their things without thinking about moving soon. And the apartment would be transformed as well. Surely repairs had been done there long ago, when the house had just been built. But immediately the cold stare of the old man appeared before her eyes, and all good thoughts were shyly hidden. How to live with him. He makes you feel frosty. It is as if he sees through a man. He pry into the soul without asking, and examines it very carefully. Miranda shivered. Charles was no longer in the kitchen, and she looked at the dark space outside the window. As cold and gloomy as the prospect of moving in. The gathering was short-lived. After several years of such a nomadic life, the young family had never managed to acquire any weighty possessions. All their belongings fit into a couple of backpacks and a few gym bags, so they came to Ernest alone. They didn't even ask their friends for help. They made it by themselves, not the first time. "Come in," the old man said sternly, and opened the apartment door wide. The young family occupied the living room. Miranda was worried that Ernest was used to living his life, and it turns out that they are now violating it. Who would like that? "Don't worry, Miranda. He even has a nice TV in his room. You can close the doors here and he won't bother you. My grandfather is a worldly man. He understands even more than we do," Charles reassured his wife. Miranda herself understood that it was unlikely that Ernest would have invited his grandson and wife to live with him if they had been a burden to him, or if he had not understood that young people had a life of their own. But he did not just ask her to come and live with him. Now she should also show herself to be a good hostess. But just with that there were great difficulties. Miranda worked as a nurse in a hospital and was not exempt from night duty. She came home exhausted. In rented apartments, she could go to bed without having eaten supper. But in Ernest's apartment, how could she do that? The first month passed unnoticed. Miranda disappeared at work or slept off duty. Charles would cook something simple himself at such times, but they were happy. Charles knew that a nurse's life did not always go according to schedule. Miranda was filling in for colleagues who were sick and those who were lucky enough to go on vacation. Sometimes he didn't see her for 24 hours, but Charles was used to that kind of life, even before he got married. Life went on as usual. Miranda returned once again from work very late. Charles was already asleep, and Ernest was reading in his room. This Miranda realized by the beam of light from under his door. She undressed, feeling the delicious aroma from the kitchen. Miranda could barely overcome the urge to run there at once and find out what her hungry stomach was beckoning her to. Habit proved stronger. She went into the bathroom and washed her hands thoroughly, then ran to the kitchen. There was still warm meat goulash in a small pot, and on a plate under foil lay cooled mashed potatoes and a note beside them: reheat. She recognized Charles' handwriting immediately. He always wrote exclusively in block letters. Only the A was a little different, but in the world of computer letters, getting such a lively message by hand was much nicer. And Miranda also had no idea that her Charles was able to make such a nourishing and tasty dish out of chicken meat. And dinner was very good, she smiled to her husband in the morning. Did you like it too? Charles was getting ready for work and buttoning the belt on his pants. Grandpa did his best. Didn't say a word. I hear something long fiddling in the kitchen. Opened the door and the aroma of food almost killed me. Charles laughed. And Miranda understood why the letter A in the note was different. Charles didn't write it. He didn't have that kind of tenderness. He wasn't romantic even in the moments before they were married. And this was a note to eat. It certainly wasn't Charles. So Ernest took care of her? Or maybe he just showed her what dinner should be like in a normal family? And her Charles is only capable of making pasta and sausage. How long can men survive on that kind of food? It was Miranda's day off, and she spent the whole day at home, trying to show what a hostess she was. But as soon as she turned off the vacuum cleaner and knocked on the closed door of Ernest's room to vacuum there as well, the door opened and Grandpa took the vacuum cleaner with a short comment. "I'll do it myself." The door did not close and Miranda could have stood and watched Ernest doing the cleaning. But she realized in time that such behavior is unacceptable and went to find herself a new occupation. It is clear that her grandfather is unlikely to let her into his world. Miranda scolded herself, dusting herself off, for not thanking Ernest for the delicious dinner. After all, he wasn't just trying for himself. Some of the old people in her hospital are quite different. They complain and grumble all the time. Whenever you ask them, it's all bad. Daughters-in-law and sons-in-law are bad. Grandchildren are bad. They don't care enough. And they also don't bring what they asked for. Of course, it wasn't from the good life that they complained, and yet it was so tiring. Ernest, on the contrary, was stingy with words and communication in general. He quickly finished cleaning his small room and returned the vacuum cleaner to its rightful place in the living room. "Ernest, thank you for dinner. It was all very delicious," Miranda murmured, catching a heavy look on her face. "You're welcome," she heard back, and the old man disappeared from view. On the one hand, Miranda was glad to be able to say thank you. But on the other hand, a stone fell on her soul. Ernest was a man of another era, strong, stern, and categorical. He shows her with his dinner that it is her concern to feed two men tasty dinners. But how could she manage both work and home? The familiar world has begun to crumble. That's the price to pay for her place. Now she should make it a habit to cook something more or less edible on her day off than store-bought meatballs and pasta. That was definitely a hint. What else had the grandfather invited his grandson and his wife for? To have the warm and caring hand of a woman in the house again, of course. Charles's mother cooks pies and cleans the apartment, and they have a 3-room apartment. There is enough cleaning there. And Miranda, she used to live in a rented apartment, and she didn't clean the floors every day. Miranda pulled out a bucket with a floor cloth. By evening, she felt worse than when she had worked 2 shifts in a row. There she could at least get a break, but here she could feel Ernest watching her. He opened the door of his room a couple of times, sighed, grunted something, and closed it back. Miranda knew that his Barbara must have done much better. She was no match for her. Exhausted and hungry, Miranda fell asleep before Charles arrived for dinner. Early in the morning, she saw a suitcase in the middle of the room and her husband running around. "Are you awake?" he asked cheerfully. "You slept through all the news." "What news?" Miranda did not understand anything and started to get ready for work. "I got a promotion at work, Miranda," smiled Charles, "but just have to go to a course in the capital. I'll be gone for 2 weeks, so it's just you and Grandpa here. Am I with him?" Miranda froze in horror as she opened the closet door. "Miranda, what are you talking about? He's nice. Don't look at his looks. He's a worldly man. He understands and supports everything. And I'll be back quickly. You'll see you won't even notice how time flies by." Charles walked over to his wife. Miranda imagined the unhappy prospect of working and cooking and cleaning the house and almost cried, and she couldn't tell Charles. What would he do? Refuse to go? Talk to grandfather? That's ridiculous. 2 weeks. She can handle it. We'll have to look at the schedule and figure out how to distribute things. Only when Miranda returned in the morning from her duty, she found the floor in the hallway still wet and freshly made pancakes in the kitchen. Not in time, she thought sadly. Ernest always got up early and by her arrival had already shown her the role of a woman in the family. Miranda sipped her tea and pancakes, swallowing the tasty treats with difficulty. Conscience gripped tightly in her throat. Miranda decided to take a nap after the night watch, reassuring herself that they still had her handmade soup for lunch, and she would think of something for dinner. The week was dragging on and on. Miranda rushed home from work and immediately took up cooking and cleaning. It was incredibly hard, but Miranda was eager to prove that she too could bring comfort and delicious food to the family. With horror, Miranda realized that it was only Thursday, and she already felt like a doormat. Miranda stood in front of the stove, hardly knowing what she was doing here. The day at work had been generous with negative emotions and running through the corridors. The names of drugs, syringes, and bandages flashed before her eyes, and disgruntled voices buzzed in her head. She hadn't been able to rest at home for days because of household chores, so mistakes at work became more frequent as well. "What are you doing?" The voice echoed with pain in my head. "What are you doing? Miranda, can you hear me? Give me that." Something was taken from her hands, and the voice became as if familiar. It was only now that she realized she was in the kitchen and Ernest was standing in front of her with a spatula in his hand. Making dinner. Miranda sat on the stool, not understanding what had happened. "I'm sorry, Miranda, but I'll tell you everything." Ernest's menacing look left no chance for an easy outcome. Miranda tensed, then decided. Since she wasn't worthy to be mistress in this house, let her be. She tried to become one. "Do you have any idea what you're doing? You work 24 hours a day and then you run out to cook. You're crazy. You're a nurse and you don't care about your health. Did they teach you badly?" the grandfather asked sternly. No, good. Miranda herself did not know how she could get those words out. "So why are you making fun of yourself? What do you think, that I can't cook a good dinner? I may be old, but I'm a decent cook. You said yourself that you liked the dinner I made." He sounded offended. "I did," Miranda agreed. "Well, leave the kitchen to the old man and go and rest quickly." He looked sternly at Miranda, and she hurried to carry out the order. Later, Ernest, washing dishes after dinner, began his story. "I didn't call you here to live with me to take care of me. I thought it would be easier for you to build a family in a nice apartment that you don't have to pay for. Plus, I can always take care of the household. I know you're a nurse, and that job doesn't tolerate fatigue. You have to rest at home. My mom worked in a hospital all her life too. And I've been able to cook since I was a kid. We lived without my father, so the whole responsibility for everyday life was on me. I even thought of becoming a doctor." Miranda saw Ernest smile warmly for the first time. "But my love for detectives changed my life, and I became a policeman. I didn't let my wife be stuck in the kitchen all the time either. She was a teacher. So while she's checking her books, I'm cooking. Then while I'm at work late, she cooks. That's how we lived. So don't think about doing chores when you're tired." He looked at Miranda again, but there were sparks of warmth in his eyes. A few days later, Miranda returned home from work, smelling of food and peace. She knew that Charles was due back tonight. But Ernest had told her not to run to the store to get groceries to make dinner. He would take care of everything, and he had. There were 2 salads and cold cuts on the kitchen table, the smell of meat and potatoes in the air, and red apples in a vase on the counter. "Here comes our Miranda back, and we've already got everything ready," reported Ernest. "Come on." Charles finished serving. While Miranda was washing her hands, she heard the conversation. Ernest was teaching Charles the finer points of cooking. The knife is on the right and the fork is on the left. It's not convenient to cut with your left hand. And don't forget the napkins, and I'll open the wine. Why don't you take your towel off your belt and hang it on your arm so you can be a waiter?" joked Charles. "And easy. It's you young men who miss the opportunity to pay attention to the woman you love. You're afraid you'll end up being a wannabe. But we old warriors know how to serve in the family, not to be a servant. Remember, while I'm alive, I'll teach you a lot more," replied the grandfather. "Grandfather, how shall we serve the meat?" Charles' voice sounded ironic. "We'll spread it out on plates from the tray. Not in a restaurant," replied Ernest simply. They both laughed, and Miranda suddenly felt as warm as she should be at home. She felt at ease again. Ernest's stern gaze was no longer frightening. Now Miranda saw in him a wall and the strong shoulder he had set up for their young family. Indeed, the world's grandfather. She whispered to herself and went into the kitchen.